Hey, story lovers! Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a heart-pounding tale of betrayal, ambition, and a pregnant woman's fight for justice in the dazzling, cutthroat world of San Francisco tech. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single twist, so hit that play button and let's get started. In the gleaming towers of San Francisco, where innovations sparkled like gold and ambition burned hotter than the summer sun, Nathan Pierce reigned supreme. At 35, he was a tech millionaire with a chiseled jaw, piercing blue eyes, and a swagger that screamed success. His company, Pierce Tech, was a rising star in the Bay Area, a family legacy he'd inherited from his father, and transformed into a powerhouse of artificial intelligence. To the world, Nathan was untouchable, a visionary draped in tailored suits, commanding boardrooms with a voice that could charm a snake or crush a rival. By his side stood Sophie Bennett, 28, his radiant wife and the beating heart of their empire. With her cascading auburn hair and a smile that could melt ice, Sophie wasn't just a pretty face, she was brilliant. A software engineer turned co-director at Pierce Tech, she'd coded some of the company's most lucrative algorithms, her nimble fingers weaving digital magic, while her pregnant belly grew rounder by the day. 5 months along, she glowed with the promise of new life, dreaming of quiet nights rocking their baby under the stars. Nathan had swept her off her feet 3 years ago at a tech conference, his bold promises and lavish gifts, a diamond necklace, a weekend in Napa Valley, sealing their whirlwind romance. Their wedding had been a spectacle, a golden union of brains and beauty, celebrated by Silicon Valley's elite. But beneath the shimmering facade of their perfect life, shadows loomed. Nathan's hunger for power gnawed at him, a relentless beast he could never quite tame. He craved more deals, more headlines, more control. Sophie, ever the optimist, chalked up his late nights and distracted glances to the pressures of running a multi-million-dollar company. "He's just stressed," she'd whisper to herself, rubbing her belly as she stared out their penthouse window, the city lights twinkling like a promise she desperately wanted to believe. Enter Lila Voss, 30, a venomous vixen with sleek black hair and a smirk that could cut glass. A sharp-tongued business consultant, Lila had slithered into Pierce Tech under the guise of streamlining operations. Her crimson stilettos clicked through the office like a predator on the prowl, her hazel eyes locking onto Nathan with a predatory glint. She wasn't just a colleague, she was his confidant, his late-night conspirator. Where Sophie radiated warmth, Lila exuded danger, her every word laced with ambition and a hint of something darker. To the casual observer, she was a professional asset. To Nathan, she was a spark igniting a fire he couldn't resist. It started innocently enough, or so Nathan told himself. A drink after a meeting, a shared laugh over a competitor's failure. But soon, those moments stretched into clandestine dinners at dimly lit restaurants, their knees brushing under the table as they plotted something far grander than a business deal. Lila leaned in one night, her voice a sultry purr. "Why share the throne, Nathan? Sophie's brilliant, sure, but she's soft. Pierce Tech could be yours, all yours." Her words sank into him like poison, feeding his ego, twisting his love for Sophie into a nagging doubt. Was she holding him back? Could he rule alone? Sophie, meanwhile, felt the shift. Nathan's kisses grew colder, his excuses sharper. "Late-night investor meeting," he'd mutter, avoiding her gaze as he grabbed his keys. She'd nod, swallowing the lump in her throat, her hands trembling as she folded tiny onesies for their unborn child. One evening, alone in their sprawling penthouse, she stumbled across a cryptic email on Nathan's tablet, a message from Lila about finalizing the plan. Her heart thudded, a sickening dread pooling in her stomach. Was it a project, or something worse? She wanted to confront him, to scream, to demand the truth, but fear held her tongue. She was pregnant, vulnerable, and still clinging to the man she'd vowed to love forever. Across town, in a sleek office overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, Julian Hayes watched silently. At 40, he was a billionaire enigma, a tech titan who'd built his fortune in cybersecurity from scratch. With salt and pepper hair and a quiet intensity, Julian was everything Nathan wasn't. Steady, unassuming, a man who valued loyalty over headlines. He'd crossed paths with Sophie at a charity gala months ago, struck by her fierce intellect and gentle grace. Little did she know, Julian would soon become her lifeline in a storm she couldn't yet see brewing. As the San Francisco fog rolled in, thick and foreboding, the stage was set for a betrayal that would shatter hearts, topple empires, and ignite a fight Sophie never saw coming. The question lingered, heavy and unanswered. Could love survive ambition's cruel blade? The San Francisco skyline glittered like a cruel mirage as Sophie Bennett sat alone in the penthouse, her trembling fingers clutching Nathan's tablet. That cryptic email from Lila Voss, finalizing the plan, gnawed at her like a relentless beast, its vague menace clawing at her fragile peace. She'd tried to dismiss it, to bury her suspicions beneath layers of hope, but the unease festered, a dark stain spreading across her heart. At 28, pregnant and vulnerable, Sophie felt the weight of her world teetering on the edge of collapse. She loved Nathan, fiercely, foolishly, but love couldn't silence the whispers of doubt now screaming in her mind. The next morning, Nathan breezed into the kitchen, his tailored suit pristine, his smile a polished mask. "Morning, babe," he said, pecking her cheek with a casualness that stung. His blue eyes darted away, avoiding hers, as he poured coffee with practiced ease. Sophie's stomach churned, not from the baby, but from the icy distance she felt radiating from him. "Late night again?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with a tremor she couldn't hide. Nathan shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Yeah, investors from Tokyo. You know how it is. Pierce Tech's on the brink of something huge." His words were smooth, rehearsed, but they rang hollow, a flimsy shield against her growing dread. Sophie forced a smile, her hands cradling her belly as if to shield their unborn child from the storm she sensed brewing. She wanted to believe him, to cling to the man who'd once promised her the stars. But that email haunted her, a splinter lodged too deep to ignore. Later that day, alone in their sleek home office, she cracked. With a racing pulse, she hacked into Nathan's private server, a skill she'd honed as Pierce Tech's coding prodigy. What she found wasn't just a splinter, it was a dagger plunged straight into her soul. Emails, dozens of them. Nathan and Lila, their words dripping with conspiracy. "Sophie's too sentimental. She'll never agree to sell off the AI division," Lila wrote. "We need her out of the boardroom before the baby comes." Nathan's reply was a gut punch. "I'll handle it. She trusts me. We'll forge the docs, call it a leave of absence. Pierce Tech's mine, ours." Sophie's breath hitched, tears blurring the screen. Forged documents? A leave of absence? They weren't just sidelining her. They were stealing her legacy, her life's work, right under her nose. The man she'd married, the father of her child, was plotting to erase her. Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor, a sob ripping through her chest. The room spun, the sterile elegance of their penthouse mocking her shattered trust. She'd built Pierce Tech with Nathan, poured her brilliance into every line of code, every late-night strategy session. And now, at 5 months pregnant, he was discarding her like a broken tool. All for power, all with Lila's venomous whispers egging him on. Rage flared beneath her heartbreak, a molten fire igniting her resolve. She wouldn't crumble, not yet. Across town, Nathan lounged in Lila's chic loft, a glass of bourbon in hand. The city sprawled beneath them, a glittering prize they both craved. Lila paced, her crimson lips curling into a triumphant smirk. "The board meeting's in 3 days," she purred, her voice a seductive blade. "We present the forged papers, Sophie's voluntary step-down, and you take full control. She'll be too busy with diapers to fight back." Nathan grinned, the bourbon burning his throat as he savored the thrill of their scheme. "She'll hate me," he mused, a flicker of guilt shadowing his arrogance. Lila laughed, sharp and cold. "She'll get over it, or she won't. Either way, you'll be king." But Sophie wasn't the docile pawn they imagined. That night, she pored over the emails, her mind racing as she pieced together their plan. They'd fabricated a document claiming she'd requested maternity leave indefinitely, complete with a forged signature. Worse, they'd drafted a proposal to sell Pierce Tech's AI division, her brainchild, to a rival firm for a fortune, splitting the profits between them. The betrayal seared her, a white-hot agony that fueled her next move. She copied the files, her hands shaking with fury, and hid them on a secure drive. Nathan wouldn't bury her without a fight. The following day, tension crackled in the Pierce Tech office. Nathan strode through the glass-walled corridors, exuding confidence, while Sophie played her part, the doting wife, the expectant mother. She smiled at him across the conference table, her eyes masking the storm within. "Big meeting tomorrow?" she asked, her tone deceptively light. Nathan nodded, oblivious to the trap tightening around him. "Yeah, just some restructuring. Nothing you need to worry about." His dismissal stung, but Sophie swallowed it, her resolve hardening like steel. That night, alone again, she uncovered the final blow. A hidden audio file, buried in Nathan's cloud, captured him and Lila laughing over champagne. "Once she's out, we'll rewrite the shares." Nathan's voice slurred. "Pierce Tech will be ours. No more family baggage." Lila's giggle sliced through the static. "Poor Sophie. She'll be rocking a cradle while we're ruling the world." The cruelty of it, reducing her to a footnote, mocking her motherhood, snapped something inside her. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't just from pain. They were from a blazing, unyielding determination. The board meeting loomed, a ticking bomb set to detonate in 24 hours. Nathan and Lila planned to unveil their coup, presenting the forged documents to oust Sophie before she could blink. They'd underestimated her, though. She wasn't just a pregnant wife. She was a warrior, armed with evidence and a heart forged in betrayal's fire. As she sat in the dark, the city's fog curling against the windows, Sophie made a vow. She'd walk into that meeting, belly swollen, head high, and rip their scheme apart. But she couldn't do it alone. Fate intervened the next morning. At a coffee shop near Pierce Tech, she bumped into Julian Hayes, the enigmatic billionaire she'd met months ago. His steady gaze met hers, and something in his quiet strength steadied her trembling soul. "You look like you're carrying the world," he said softly, his voice a balm to her frayed nerves. Sophie hesitated, then spilled a fragment of her truth. "I'm about to lose everything." Julian's eyes darkened with understanding. "You don't have to," he replied, slipping her his card. "Call me if you need a friend, or a fighter." As Sophie clutched that card, a lifeline in her storm, Nathan and Lila finalized their plot across town. They toasted to their victory, oblivious to the tempest-gathering strength. The boardroom would be their battlefield, and Sophie, betrayed, pregnant, and ferocious, was ready to strike. Tomorrow, the lie would crumble, and the fallout would shake San Francisco to its core. The morning sun pierced through San Francisco's fog, casting a golden glow over Pierce Tech's gleaming headquarters. But inside, a storm was brewing, fierce, unyielding, and ready to erupt. Sophie Bennett stood before her bedroom mirror, her auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, her 5-month pregnant belly straining against a tailored black blazer. Her hazel eyes burned with a fire that hadn't flickered there before, a molten mix of heartbreak, fury, and resolve. Today wasn't just a board meeting. It was a battlefield, and she was armed to the teeth with evidence that would shred Nathan's betrayal into 1,000 jagged pieces. She clutched the secure drive in her pocket, its weight a silent promise of vengeance. The emails, the audio, the forged documents, every damning word Nathan Pierce and Lila Voss had conspired behind her back now rested in her hands. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with strategies, her heart pounding with the echoes of their cruel laughter. "Poor Sophie," Lila had sneered in that recording. "Ruling the world," Nathan had boasted. Today, she'd show them just how wrong they were. Across town, Nathan strode into Pierce Tech's glass-walled boardroom, his confidence a swaggering beast. At 35, he oozed power. Crisp suit, sharp grin, a man who believed the world bent to his will. Lila trailed behind, her crimson stilettos clicking like a war drum, her smirk a venomous slash across her face. They carried a sleek folder, the forged leave of absence papers, ready to present their coup to the board. The room buzzed with anticipation as shareholders and executives filed in, their murmurs a low hum of curiosity. Nathan nodded at Lila, a silent signal. This is it. We win. Sophie arrived last, her entrance a quiet thunderclap. Heads turned, whispers rippled. She moved with deliberate grace, her pregnant frame commanding respect, her expression an unreadable mask. Nathan's grin faltered for a split second, a flicker of unease, but he masked it with a patronizing smile. "Sophie, you didn't have to come," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "This is just routine stuff." She met his gaze, her eyes cold as steel. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied, her tone a blade wrapped in velvet. The meeting began, and Nathan took the floor, his voice smooth as silk. "Pierce Tech's at a turning point," he declared, pacing with theatrical flair. "To secure our future, we're proposing a bold restructuring. My wife," he gestured to Sophie with a condescending nod, "has graciously agreed to step back for maternity leave, effective immediately." Lila slid the forged document across the table, her hazel eyes glinting with triumph. The board skimmed it, nodding approvingly, all except Sophie, who sat still as stone, her hands folded over her belly. Then she stood, slow and deliberate, her presence swelling to fill the room. "That's an interesting story, Nathan," she said, her voice steady but laced with ice. "But it's a lie." The air thickened, a collective gasp sucking the oxygen from the space. Nathan's jaw tightened, Lila's smirk froze. Sophie pulled a sleek laptop from her bag, plugging it into the projector with a calm that belied the storm inside her. "Let's see the truth," she said, and clicked play. The screen flared to life, displaying the first email, Nathan's words in stark black and white. "She trusts me. We'll forge the docs." Murmurs erupted. Then the audio hit, Nathan's slurred voice booming through the speakers. "Once she's out, we'll rewrite the shares." Lila's giggle followed, sharp and vicious. "Poor Sophie, rocking a cradle while we're ruling the world." The boardroom exploded into chaos. Gasps, shouts, fists pounding the table. Nathan's face drained of color, his swagger collapsing into a stunned, gaping void. Lila's stilettos shifted nervously, her bravado crumbling. "You faked my signature," Sophie said, her voice rising, quivering with righteous fury. "You planned to sell my AI division, my life's work, and steal Pierce Tech from me while I'm carrying your child." She slammed the secure drive onto the table, the thud echoing like a gavel. "It's all here. Every email, every recording. You didn't just betray me, Nathan. You betrayed everyone in this room." The shareholders' eyes darted between her and Nathan, their trust in him evaporating like mist in the sun. Nathan scrambled, his voice cracking. "This is a misunderstanding. She's hormonal, emotional. She's twisting things." But the board wasn't buying it. An older executive, gray-haired and stern, snatched the forged document, comparing it to Sophie's real signature on file. "This is fraud," he growled, glaring at Nathan. "You're done." Lila leapt to her feet, her voice shrill. "I had no part in this. He forced me." Nathan whirled on her, snarling. "You liar! This was your idea!" Their alliance shattered in real time, a venomous tangle of blame and desperation. Sophie didn't flinch. She'd called Julian Hayes the night before, his calm voice steadying her as she'd outlined her plan. "Bring the evidence," he'd said. "I'll handle the rest." True to his word, the boardroom doors swung open, and Julian strode in, all 40 years of quiet authority wrapped in a charcoal suit. His salt and pepper hair gleamed under the lights, his presence a lifeline Sophie hadn't known she'd needed. "I've reviewed Mrs. Pierce's files," he announced, his tone unshakable. As a majority investor in Pierce Tech, I'm calling an emergency vote to remove Nathan Pierce as CEO, effective now. The room erupted again, but Julian's gravitas silenced the din. Hands shot up, one, two, then a flood, until the vote was unanimous. Nathan's reign was over. He staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief, his empire slipping through his fingers like sand. Lila bolted for the door, her heels clattering in a frantic retreat, but security blocked her path. "You're not going anywhere," Julian said coolly. "The SEC will want a word about this fraud." Sophie stood tall, her belly a defiant emblem of her strength. She locked eyes with Nathan, her voice trembling but fierce. "You thought I'd break. You thought I'd let you take everything. But this company, this child, they're mine, and you'll never touch them again." Nathan's mouth opened, a plea forming, but no words came. He'd lost, spectacularly, irreversibly, and the weight of it crushed him into silence. As security escorted Nathan and Lila out, the board swarmed Sophie, their apologies a chaotic chorus. She nodded, exhausted but victorious, her hand resting protectively over her unborn child. Julian approached, his dark eyes warm with admiration. "You were incredible," he said softly. "I've never seen anyone fight like that." Sophie managed a shaky smile, tears prickling her eyes. "I had to. For my baby. For me." The fallout was swift. News of Nathan's ousting hit the tech world like a thunderclap, headlines screaming Pierce Tech CEO caught in fraud scandal. Stocks plummeted, then steadied as Julian stepped in, pledging support to stabilize the company. Sophie, still reeling, retreated to her penthouse, the secure drive now a trophy of her triumph. She sank onto the couch, her body trembling with adrenaline's aftershock, and let the tears fall. Not of defeat, but of release. Nathan, meanwhile, slumped in a hotel bar across town, bourbon his only companion. Lila had abandoned him, fleeing to save her own skin, leaving him to face the wreckage alone. His phone buzzed with furious texts from his father, disowning him, and investors pulling out. The king of Pierce Tech was now a pariah, his arrogance a noose tightening around his neck. He stared into his glass, the bitter sting of regret seeping into his bones. Sophie had won, not just the company, but her dignity, her future. Back at the penthouse, Sophie gazed out at the city, the fog curling like a shroud over her old life. Julian's card lay on the table, a quiet promise of alliance, and maybe more. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She'd clawed her way out of betrayal's jaws, and no one would ever underestimate her again. The San Francisco skyline shimmered under a soft October dusk, its golden hues painting a fragile hope over the chaos Sophie Bennett had just conquered. At 28, she stood in her penthouse, victorious yet bruised, her hands cradling her swollen belly as if anchoring herself to the life still blooming within. Pierce Tech was hers again, wrested from Nathan's greedy claws, but the triumph tasted bittersweet, laced with the ashes of a love she'd once believed unbreakable. The boardroom battle had left her drained, her heart a tender wound, yet beneath the exhaustion flickered a spark of resilience, fierce and unyielding. Days turned to weeks, and the city buzzed with the fallout of Nathan's disgrace. Headlines blared his ruin. Tech tycoon toppled by pregnant wife's brilliance, while Sophie retreated from the spotlight, her focus narrowing to the quiet miracle of her pregnancy. At 7 months, her belly was a gentle curve, a testament to the strength she'd summoned to protect her child. She painted a nursery in soft blues and yellows, her fingers trembling as she hung a mobile of twinkling stars, each one a whispered promise to her baby. "You'll never know betrayal like I did." Nathan, meanwhile, spiraled into a shadow of his former self. Holed up in a dingy hotel room across town, the 35-year-old ex-CEO nursed his bourbon and his regrets. His empire had crumbled, his father's wrath had severed their bond, and Lila Voss, that treacherous siren, had vanished, leaving him to drown in the wreckage alone. He stared at his phone, Sophie's radiant wedding photo mocking him from the screen. How had he let ambition blind him to her worth? The question gnawed at him, a relentless ache, but pride kept him silent, until desperation cracked it open. One rainy evening, he showed up at Sophie's penthouse, disheveled and hollow-eyed, rain dripping from his once pristine suit. She opened the door, her expression a fortress of ice, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "What do you want, Nathan?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth he'd once taken for granted. He swallowed, his throat raw. "I'm sorry, Soph. I was a fool, a greedy, arrogant fool. I never meant to hurt you like this." His words trembled, fragile with remorse, but they landed like pebbles against a steel wall. Sophie's eyes narrowed, her pain flaring into a quiet fury. "You didn't just hurt me," she said, her tone cutting through the rain's soft patter. "You tried to steal everything, my work, my future, our child's legacy. Sorry doesn't fix that." She stepped back, her hand on the door. "Leave, Nathan. We're done." The door clicked shut, a final resounding note to their shattered past. He stood there, soaked and broken, the weight of her rejection sinking into his bones. She wasn't his anymore. Maybe she never truly had been. As winter crept closer, Sophie's world shifted again. One stormy night, her water broke, a sudden rush that sent her gasping to the floor. She called Julian Hayes, her voice shaking but steady, and he arrived like a knight through the tempest, his calm presence a balm to her panic. At the hospital, he stayed by her side, his hand gripping hers through hours of wrenching labor. When dawn broke, a piercing cry filled the room. Her daughter, Emma Grace, was born, a tiny, perfect marvel with Sophie's auburn wisps and a spirit that seemed to defy the chaos she'd entered. Sophie cradled Emma, tears streaming down her cheeks, a tidal wave of love washing away the scars Nathan had left. Julian watched, his dark eyes soft with awe. "She's beautiful," he murmured, brushing a finger against Emma's tiny hand. "Just like her mother." Sophie smiled, fragile but genuine, her heart stirring with something new, a warmth she hadn't felt in months. Julian didn't push, didn't demand. He simply stayed, a quiet pillar in her storm-tossed life. Weeks passed, and Sophie rebuilt her world brick by brick. She returned to Pierce Tech as interim CEO, her brilliance steering the company back from the brink. Emma became her anchor, her coos and giggles a melody that soothed Sophie's jagged edges. Julian remained a constant, delivering meals when she was too tired to cook, rocking Emma when Sophie needed a moment to breathe. His steadiness was a revelation, so unlike Nathan's flamboyant chaos. At 40, Julian carried a quiet strength, his salt and pepper hair a crown of wisdom, his every gesture laced with care. One crisp evening, as Emma dozed in her crib, Julian cooked dinner in Sophie's kitchen. A simple pasta, fragrant with basil and hope. They sat across from each other, the silence comfortable, the air thick with unspoken possibilities. "You've been my rock," Sophie said, her voice soft, her hazel eyes searching his. "I don't know how I'd have gotten through this without you." Julian set down his fork, his gaze steady and warm. "You're stronger than you know, Sophie. I just wanted to be there when you needed someone." Her heart thudded, a tender ache blooming within. She'd guarded it so fiercely since Nathan's betrayal, but Julian's patience chipped away at her walls. "Why me?" she asked, vulnerability trembling in her words. He leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. "Because you're real, brave, brilliant, and kinder than anyone I've met. You and Emma, you're worth everything." Lun. The confession hung between them, fragile and luminous, and Sophie felt her defenses crumble, replaced by a tentative trust. Across town, Nathan's life unraveled further. Fired from Pierce Tech, shunned by the tech elite, he scraped by on dwindling savings, his pride a tattered rag. He tried calling Sophie, leaving voicemails thick with regret. "I want to see Emma, Soph. I'll do better, I swear." But she never answered. Her silence was a punishment he couldn't escape, a mirror reflecting the man he'd become. One night, drunk and desperate, he stumbled to a park near her penthouse, staring up at the glowing windows. He imagined her with Emma, happy without him, and the realization crushed him. He'd lost them forever. Back at the penthouse, spring arrived, and with it, a shift. Sophie invited Julian to Emma's first birthday, a small gathering of close friends. He arrived with a hand-carved rocking horse, his grin boyish and bright. As Emma giggled, tugging at his tie, Sophie watched, her heart swelling with a quiet joy. Later, under the soft glow of fairy lights, Julian took her hand, his touch gentle but electric. "I love you, Sophie," he said, his voice a steady vow. "You and Emma, you're my world. I'll wait as long as you need, but I want us to be a family." Tears prickled her eyes, fear warring with longing. Nathan's betrayal had scarred her, but Julian's love was a balm, steady and true. She squeezed his hand, her voice a whisper. "I'm scared, Julian, but I love you too. Let's take it slow, for Emma, for us." He nodded, pulling her close, and in his arms she felt safe, a sanctuary she'd thought lost forever. News of their bond trickled through San Francisco's gossip mills, whispers of the pregnant CEO's comeback, morphing into tales of a new power couple. Sophie didn't care for the headlines. She cared for the mornings waking to Emma's laughter, the nights curling up with Julian, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against her own. Nathan faded to a ghost in her past, his pleas ignored, his redemption a burden he'd carry alone. As spring blossoms painted the city, Sophie stood on her balcony, Emma in her arms, Julian by her side. The scars remained, faint but real, but they no longer defined her. She'd fallen, fought, and risen, a mother, a leader, a woman reclaimed. And in Julian's quiet love, she found a dawn brighter than the darkest nights she'd endured. San Francisco bloomed under a crisp spring sky, its winds whispering renewal as Sophie Bennett stood at the edge of a new chapter. At 29, she was no longer the betrayed wife clawing her way out of darkness. She was a mother, a leader, a woman radiant with hard-earned joy. 2 years after Nathan's fall, she'd rebuilt Pierce Tech into a beacon of innovation, her brilliance outshining the shadows he'd cast. And now, in a sun-drenched garden overlooking the bay, she prepared to marry Julian Hayes, the steady rock who'd turned her scars into strength. The ceremony was intimate, a tapestry of love woven with close friends and family. Sophie wore a flowing ivory gown, her auburn hair cascading in soft waves, her hazel eyes sparkling with peace. Little Emma, now a spirited 2-year-old, toddled down the aisle in a daisy crown, scattering petals with gleeful abandon. Julian, 41, stood waiting, his salt and pepper hair glinting in the sunlight, his dark eyes brimming with devotion. "I promise to cherish you both," he vowed, his voice a warm anchor, "through every storm and every dawn." Sophie smiled, tears glistening, and whispered, "You already have." They kissed as cheers erupted, Emma clapping her tiny hands, the bay breeze carrying their joy across the city. Pierce Tech thrived under their partnership, a powerhouse of tech and compassion, while Nathan Pierce faded into obscurity. At 37, he'd clawed back a sliver of stability, a small consulting gig, a modest apartment, but the glitz of his old life was gone. Sophie had granted him supervised visits with Emma every other Sunday, a fragile thread to his daughter. He'd sit with her in a park, her giggles a bittersweet balm, her auburn curls a mirror of the wife he'd lost. "Papa," she'd chirp, and he'd smile, hollow but grateful, knowing Julian was daddy in her everyday world. One afternoon, after a visit, Nathan lingered near the garden, where Sophie and Julian's reception hummed with laughter. Hidden behind a hedge, he watched her dance with Julian, Emma on his hip, their family a portrait of wholeness he'd never replicate. Regret stabbed him, sharp and relentless, but for the first time, he let it settle, a quiet acceptance of the life he'd squandered. Sophie had risen, radiant and unbreakable, and he'd become a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered in tech circles. As the sun dipped low, Sophie rested her head on Julian's shoulder, Emma dozing in her arms. The past was a faint echo, drowned by the steady pulse of love surrounding her. She'd fought, fallen, and soared. And in that garden, under a sky ablaze with promise, she knew she'd found her forever. Hey, amazing viewers! Thanks for joining Sophie's epic journey. From betrayal to triumph, it's been a wild ride. What did you think? Drop a comment below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more heart-pounding stories. You're the best. See you next time.